Now we're going to do a little bit of a focus on this dispenser requirements and preparation. And we have back with us Eric Marshall from PDG, Steve Postal from NCPA, and Max Peoples from Max. I picked Uptown Pharmacy just to, kind of spinning through your Rolodex of items.
That works. That works.
Okay,
Okay, is it okay if I start?
please do.
All right, yeah, I'm
Just
going to start, and then my colleagues will follow me, and then we can take some questions after the three of us talk. But good morning, approaching good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my presentation on the dispenser requirements and preparation for DSCSA. Before going into my presentation, just wanted to give everyone our antitrust statement. So NCA's policy is to comply fully and strictly with both federal and state antitrust laws. In order to do this, competitors should not discuss certain topics, and those include prices, price trends, timing of price changes, discounts and rebates, and the like. Participants have an obligation to terminate any discussion, seek legal counsel's advice, or even if necessary, to terminate the meeting if the discussion might be construed to raise any antitrust risks. And if you have any questions, please consult our outside counsel on this matter, and that's Emily Jenkins, and her contact information is provided on this slide. So NCPA, just to give some brief background, we're the voice for the community pharmacist. We currently represent about 19,400 pharmacies, and that collectively employ about 240,000 individuals nationwide. And as mentioned earlier, my name is Steve Postal, and I'm the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at NCPA. So first, look at some brief learning objectives for this presentation so that we're all on the same page. Upon completion of the presentation, we hope that participants understand the purpose and requirements of the DSCSA, what suspect and illegitimate product is, the processes for identifying and investigating suspect product, and finally, the procedures that ensure community pharmacies comply with the DSCSA. And first part of my presentation, just wanted to give a brief background on the purpose and requirements of the DSCSA. But in order to do that, just like to first take a step back and look at how we got here. And the regulatory regime really started in the late 80s with the Prescription Drug Marketing Act, or the PDMA. So the purpose of the PDMA was to provide guardrails for ensuring that prescription drug distribution was safe and effective, while discouraging the sale of counterfeit, adulterated, and misbranded prescription drugs. However, the law soon became outdated. The law failed to address today's counterfeit circumstances, technologies, and business conditions, for example, interstate distribution. So then came the pedigree laws, specifically California's e-pedigree law. These laws facilitated the creation of pedigrees, or records, in electronic form. And they contained information regarding each transaction resulting in a change of ownership of a given dangerous drug through various entities in the supply chain up into the final sale of the end users. And these entities included wholesalers, manufacturers, or pharmacies. Most importantly, this created a real-time interoperable tracking system. However, there was too much data to process. It was also very cumbersome for pharmacies, involving scanners, and implementation of these laws was extremely costly. To pharmacies specifically, at approximately $100,000 per individual pharmacy in the first year. Then came the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2013, or the DQSA. So the first title, Title 1, deals with compounding. And the second one is the focus of our discussion, and that's the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or DSCSA. So the purpose of the DSCSA is to implement an interoperable electronic tracing of products at the package level by 2023. So this includes several key aspects. First, the DSCSA facilitates electronic exchange of transaction information for each sale of prescription drugs. The law also uses product identifiers to verify product at the package level. Third, the DSCSA supports prompt response to suspect and illegitimate products when found. And lastly, the law improves efficiency of recalls. The DSCSA also established national standards for licensure for wholesale distributors and third-party logistics providers, referred to as 3PLs. The law also preempts those state pedigree laws that I talked about before. And just for your reference, there's a Q&A guidance document from FDA that's published this February, providing some clarification and specifics on how state laws on tracing were preempted. So what's important to note is what products are governed under the DSCSA and which are not. The products that are governed under the law include prescription drugs in furnished dosage form for administration to a patient without further manufacturing. And these include capsules, tablets, and lyophilized products before reconstitution. What are not covered includes a long list: over-the-counter drugs, medical devices, active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs, or drugs indicated for animal use. Additionally, blood and blood components intended for transfusion, radioactive drugs and radioactive biologics, imaging drugs, intravenous products, medical gases, and compounded drugs. The four key requirements of the DSCSA that I will discuss as they relate to dispensers include product tracing data, product with serialized IDs, authorized trading partners, and finally, product verification. And I'll discuss each of these over the next few slides. For product tracing, dispensers must remember some key things. First, dispensers should only accept ownership of products that have tracing data. And by tracing data, this means transaction information and a transaction statement. Transaction history will no longer be required in November 2023, as it will be replaced with the interoperable electronic tracing of product at the package level at that time. Second, dispensers can transfer ownership of drugs if they are able to provide this tracing data. And lastly, dispensers must capture tracing data and maintain it for 6 years. Key to note is that the first two requirements do not apply when a specific patient need exists. And I'll discuss what that means in a future slide. Additionally, dispensers should only accept ownership of products that have a DSCSA compliant identifier. Technically, products that are packaged prior to November 27, 2018 are grandfathered and do not need such an identifier. But that being said, on the practical level, product data probably doesn't go much beyond 4 years, so we guess that there isn't much grandfathered product around anymore unless it's, say, part of the strategic national stockpile or the state stockpile. I do not have a list of exempted products to point you to, but I wish I did. But key to note here is that if a small package doesn't have a 2D barcode and the human readable equivalent information, the suspect product investigation may be very short, and any future packages received may be immediately deemed cleared. As of November 27, 2020, dispensers can only buy and sell product that contains the DSCSA compliant product identifier. The product identifier data is specifically required under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to be in a two-dimensional data matrix barcode for packages and a linear or two-dimensional data matrix barcode for homogeneous cases, which can be verified using human-readable and machine-readable methods. The product identifier must be affixed or imprinted on the smallest individual saleable units of product for distribution by a manufacturer or repackager that is intended by the manufacturer for ultimate sale to a dispenser of such product. FDA clarified in guidance in June of 2021 that a QR code is not a form of 2D matrix barcode and therefore cannot be used as a product identifier. A DSCSA compliant product identifier contains an NDC, a serial number, a lot number, and an expiration date. In that guidance published in June 2021, FDA recommended against using the GS1 Global Trade Identification Number, or GTIN, in place of or instead of a separate NDC in the human readable portion of the product identifier. The FDA reiterated in that guidance that under the DSCSA, the product identifier must include the NDC in both human readable and machine readable form. However, FDA also recognized that in addition to the 3-segment NDC, companies might also affix or imprint the human readable GTIN on the package label in close proximity to product identifier elements. So, what does this all mean for dispensers? Well, the serial number is key for being able to verify whether a particular package has been illegally introduced or reintroduced into the supply chain. Verification of the serialized product ID will reveal if the manufacturer or repackager assigned it and whether it was ever reported lost, stolen, damaged, or otherwise decommissioned. Product identifiers are not required if the product is grandfathered, as I discussed before, or is subject to a waiver, exception, or exemption under the law. Another dispenser requirement is to only deal with authorized trading partners. An authorized trading partner must be licensed if they are pharmacies, wholesale distributors, and 3PLs. In the case of manufacturers and repackagers, they must be registered. Another key dispenser requirement is product verification. That is, the dispenser must identify the suspect product, and if identified, the dispenser then has to quarantine and investigate the suspect product. And this includes a verification with trading partners to determine whether the product is illegitimate. For example, the dispenser should verify with the manufacturer or repackager if the lot number on the product is an actual lot number created by the manufacturer or repackager. The dispenser must also document and maintain the investigation report for 6 years. And finally, the dispenser needs to facilitate a final disposition of the illegitimate product, including retaining a sample. And key to note here is that the dispenser needs to notify the HHS secretary as well as immediate trading partners that the dispenser has reason to believe may have received the illegitimate product and must do so within 24 hours after making the determination. So there are several products that are excluded from the requirements of the DSCSA. First, the specific patient need exclusion. So under this exclusion, the transfer of a product from one pharmacy to another to fill a prescription for an identified patient does not need to be accompanied by transaction information in a transaction statement. This exclusion applies regardless of whether the two pharmacies are affiliated in any way. There are also several instances that do not constitute a transaction under the DSCSA. One is the office use exemption, which exempts the distribution of minimal quantities of products by a licensed retail pharmacy to a licensed practitioner for office use. Another is the mergers exemption, and this exempts distribution of a product pursuant to a sale or merger of a pharmacy or wholesaler. The third exemption is combination products. So for example, a device plus a drug, another device, or a biologic. And lastly, another exemption are drugs distributed for emergency medical reasons. And the distribution of a product for emergency medical reasons can include a public health emergency. Key to note here is that a drug shortage that's not caused by a public health emergency does not count toward an emergency medical reason. Now let's do a deeper dive into the definitions of suspect product and illegitimate product. For suspect product, a suspect product is when the dispenser has a reason to believe that the product is potentially counterfeit, diverted, or stolen, subject to a fraudulent transaction, intentionally adulterated, or appears otherwise unfit for distribution such that would result in serious adverse health consequences or death in humans. On the other hand, an illegitimate product has a different standard. The term illegitimate product means a product for which credible evidence shows that the product is counterfeit, diverted, or stolen, is intentionally adulterated such that the product would result in serious adverse health consequences or death, is the subject of a fraudulent transaction, or appears otherwise unfit for distribution such that the product would be reasonably likely to result in serious adverse health consequences or death. So let's look at some case studies representative of real scenarios that a typical community pharmacy might face. In the first case study, the pharmacy receives a tote containing 4 unit of use packages of Persista. However, the pharmacy ordered only 3 packages. So in the simple set of facts, do you think that there is a suspect product in the tote? So your choices are A, there is no suspect product in the tote. B, there is 1 package that is suspect product. C, there are 4 packages that are suspect product. Or D, I am unsure. And I'll give you guys a quick 30 seconds to just kind of think about this on your own. Okay, 20 seconds. 10 seconds. And that's time. Okay, so the correct answer by these facts alone is D, I am unsure. As the pharmacist, I take the next step of looking at my tracing data to see how many matches I have between the packages in the tote and the serialized product identifiers my wholesaler said they sent to me. So in the next few slides, I'll discuss processes for dispensers to identify and investigate suspect product. Let's see, hold on. Give me a second. I gotcha. So we've discussed the DSCSA definition of suspect product, but what are some examples of a suspect product in the real world? So a good starting point is a June 2021 FDA guidance on identifying suspect product that discusses many of these. But in short, a suspect product, for example, could have altered, damaged, or broken packaging. It could have wrong or mixed tabs or caps inside. It could be missing information on the label, or could have a 2D barcode that's unreadable. It could also look different than the products on the shelf. There could be lot numbers or expiration dates that do not match the outer or inner container. And there could also be wrong serialized product identifiers. Additionally, could be missing or have a wrong package insert. There could be a product name that's different from the FDA approved label. The RX only symbol could be missing from the label. There could be bubbling on the label, or the label or the packaging could be in a foreign language. So to go back to our first case, let me give you some more facts. It turns out your trading partner for this case is your primary wholesaler. Also, only 3 out of the 4 serialized product identifiers, or SPIs, transferred to the pharmacy match. It's not readily apparent that there is any tampering, damage, or forgery. But the product does not have, the product does have a high sales price. The product also is in a category that has previously been counterfeited, but the product is not in shortage. The pharmacy technician checking in the order follows store procedures and puts all 4 packages in quarantine while investigating the order discrepancy. Before I move on here, I just want to say more about matching the serialized product identifiers. So each pharmacy owner is going to need to assess their risk tolerance against the work needed to 100% validate the order received against the tracing data sent. You know that picking errors happen, and sometimes they're very easy to spot. But imagine if this case study discussed 3 packages ordered and 3 received, but only 2 of the serialized product identifiers matched. Having this level of traceability is unprecedented. You could accept the order based on the counts of everything being right, but there are advantages to scanning every package and validating the order. First, it's possible that your wholesaler will not accept a saleable return that they didn't send you, so if you have a mismatched SPI, you're stuck with the package. It also helps that you respond better to a recall. In other words, you'll know for certain if you received and subsequently dispensed recalled drugs. And finally, it's likely to catch up with you anyway when one of the wholesaler customers validates an order and investigates a mismatch.
Steve,
Yes.
can you please press hide on that little pop-up thing so we can see the last row on your text?
Oh, I'm sorry about that, Chris. Thank you.
Cheers.
Gotcha. So under these additional facts, how likely would it be that any of the 4 packages are illegitimate product? A, unlikely any are illegitimate, so you should close the investigation and move the 4 packages to inventory. B, there's a small possibility remains that 1 or more of the packages is illegitimate, so continue the investigation. C, it's highly likely 1 or more packages is illegitimate, so continue the investigation. Or D, I am unsure. And I'll give you all, again, 30 seconds to just briefly ponder this before I'll tell you the answer. All right, 20 seconds. 10 seconds. Okay, great. So I would select B here because I had a package that my wholesaler didn't tell me they sent me, and I need to figure out if the tote or any contents ever left the secured supply chain. A tech might be following a very risk-averse procedure if she were to quarantine all 4 packages. So remember a few slides back that I said my next step would be to check the serialized product identifiers. Well, this would be a good quality assurance check. So some additional facts. The serialized product identifier verification request enabled by interoperability reports that the SPI did not leave the secure supply chain. So what does it mean that it never left the supply chain? Well, the SPI was commissioned by the manufacturer and was never reported lost, damaged, or stolen. The SPI is still owned by the wholesaler. So the next step is to determine if the pharmacy will return the surplus package or buy the package and receive the tracing data for the SPI. And while we're still running on the assumption that November 27th, 2023 will remain the date for interoperability implementation. So currently, electronic verification is not widely available. And most pharmacies are going to leverage the services of a DSCSA solutions provider to manage tracing data and verification requests. So, how can dispensers best prepare for November 27th, 2023? And this I took from a presentation from the boards of pharmacy. But it's key for dispensers to be ready to receive or exchange transaction information with specific product identifiers for each package and transaction statements electronically. Dispensers should also implement systems and processes for package level verification when needed, such as in the case of investigating suspicious product. Dispensers should also implement processes to produce serialized transaction information if, say, the FDA, a state regulator, or a trading partner requests information for an investigation. And lastly, dispensers should talk to their wholesalers or direct suppliers of their drug product to see how they may be able to assist in storing transaction information. So continuing our first case, some more facts. The technicians initiated suspect product investigation and quarantined all 4 packages. The investigation factors point to a low likelihood that any of the 4 packages are illegitimate product. The SPI verification result makes the technician confident that these packages are cleared product and therefore safe to dispense to a patient. The investigation report is filed and then saved for 6 years, and the technician resolves the inventory discrepancy with the wholesaler. So in this case, the pharmacy resolves the discrepancy by purchasing and receiving the tracing data for the additional package or returning the package with the SPI not transferred to the pharmacy. So the next question is a good one for credentialers, service providers, and dispensers alike. And this really gets to knowing the level of understanding of the dispensers in DSCSA compliance. So just something to think about. I don't have an answer for you on this on the next slide, but do the pharmacies you work with have a written procedure for identifying and investigating suspect product? No, I did not know about this requirement. No, but I know about the requirement. Yes, but it needs updating and or staff that was last trained on this procedure more than a year ago. Yes, and it's up to date and staff have been trained recently. Or I'm unsure if my pharmacy has a procedure or not. Okay, so another quick case study. A pharmacy ordered a 12-pack of an ophthalmic drug at special pricing advertised on a fax for short dating. The order arrives and 12 cartons are packed loose between packing paper. So there are 2 lots, 10 of one and 2 of the other. Now, do you see any red flags in this scenario? Some key investigation factors to look at for this case. First, the trading partner. Is the distributor an authorized trading partner? And did the seller provide transaction data? The distributor may be appropriately licensed, but since it's a new trading partner for the pharmacy, additional scrutiny is warranted. Also, the pharmacy should take note of visual signs of tampering, damage, or forgery. Key to note here is that the product was advertised as a 12-pack, but it arrived in loose packaging and as a mixed lot. And also, pharmacists should think about if the special pricing was too good to be true. Another thing to note is that an unsolicited offer via a fax, it can indicate an elevated risk for suspect product. And regardless, the pharmacy should use the form FDA 3911 to report illegitimate product to the HHS secretary. Okay, so the final section, I just wanted to talk about procedures that ensure your community pharmacy complies with DSCSA. And I'm not going to steal Max's thunder at all. He's going to get more into detail with this stuff, but just to give you an overview. Some of these, the key policies and procedures that a dispenser should have in place, include with regard to selecting a prescription drug wholesaler, and also making sure that every pharmacy needs to have a policy that all orders are inspected at check-in for suspect product risk factors, and a corresponding procedure for staff to follow for the inspection. So if the order check-in inspection turns up suspect product, the pharmacy needs to quarantine and investigate it to determine if it will be cleared product that's safe for dispensing, or if it's an illegitimate product and illegally entering the supply chain. So key to note is that a quarantine needs to be in place, a place in the pharmacy that will prevent the products in quarantine from being dispensed. Ideally, you'd want a specific location that is designated only for quarantine product. But a more practical approach could be to have materials to secure and label a tote as a quarantine location. So think signs that say quarantine and zip ties or tamper evident fasteners, for example. The pharmacy must also have policies and procedures around verification and documentation investigation. And then pharmacies need to have procedures around reporting illegitimate product and responding to regulator or trading partner requests for tracing data. But in general, it's important for the pharmacies to have a game plan. They need to be able to know how to deal with their authorized trading partners. They need to not only have the procedures in place, but to use them with regard to inspection and investigation. And lastly, they need to make sure they're maintaining records of the transaction data, suspect product investigations, and all the FDA 3911 forms that they've submitted. And this last slide is just a glossary of terms of things that we talked about earlier and things you just want to be familiar with. And the last slide are a couple of resources that you can use moving forward. The first is FDA's page on the DSCSA that has the law itself, as well as all of the guidances, both those that are in draft and those that are in final form. The second bullet is a link that was made by HDA, and that is a good resource for dispensers and documents to know for compliance with DSCSA, including a dispenser checklist that NCPA is in the process of updating with cooperation with PDG and some other stakeholders. And finally, FDA's pharmacist page, and this is a page where it talks about the DSCSA from the pharmacist perspective. So with that being said, I will now turn it over to my colleague, Eric, and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm going to attempt to share here. Looks like it got the... All right. Steve, Bob, somebody see slides all right? Hear me okay?
Yes, I
Yep,
see.
looks good.
So I'm just going to kind of double click down on some of the key questions that I've heard over the last many months that Steve kind of started to touch on there, and just go a little bit deeper. Won't repeat this slide that I already ran people through last session, but just to note that I'm speaking kind of from that PDG blueprint perspective, how we've approached it in PDG and the conversations that we've had within that group. I want to double click, like I said, on maybe 5 of the top questions that I seem to hear going a layer deeper there. 1, do I have to scan every product, right? What does this mean for my receiving process? 2, how do I handle misalignment exceptions? So Steve kind of talked through one of those examples, right, where you don't have the data for a physical product that came in. How do you do that from a process perspective? How do I trace a product? Can I still engage in those dispenser to dispenser transactions like Steve kind of walked through? And then the last one was one that it kind of came up yesterday, actually, and I'm not sure it got answered, so I was going to touch on it, which I think is an important one. Can I actually get in trouble for this stuff? So the first one, do I have to scan every product? Right, this is the question that seems to come up in people's receiving processes. So what I'll say from a pure statutory perspective, right, the requirement is to not accept ownership of a product unless you have received TI for that product. The question then is, how do you operationalize that? How do you determine whether you have TI for that product, and to what extent do you have to assure that that product or that TI is accurate? So it's a question that has come up a lot. It's not clearly and explicitly answered in the statute, but as we discussed this and wrestled with it within PDG, I kind of think about you kind of have this spectrum of activities that you could take in your receiving process. All the way to the right-hand side, you can say, hey, I'm going to check every product that comes in my door. I'm going to physically pick up every package, scan it, check to make sure I have correct, accurate data for that product before I receive it into inventory and take ownership. The other end of the data, right, is to not really do any checking. Basically say, hey, I got a shipment, an electronic file came in. I'm going to just trust that the wholesaler gave me the right data, and so I'm going to bring this stuff in inventory and get moving, right? And then you have a whole series of options in between, right, where you could do some sort of sampling or auditing program to say, hey, risk-based approach. Say, when it's this kind of stuff, I'll check this many. When it's this much, I won't check that many. Kind of some level of sampling or auditing. Where we landed within in PDG, which I think is pretty consistent with how FDA generally approaches kind of quality systems, is you have to have some controlled process where you're doing some level of checking, or stated in the inverse, you can't just and should not just blindly trust the data, right? You should not be just saying, hey, I got a shipment in today and an electronic file showed up, so I'm good, gonna receive this product. You need to have some well-controlled process for checking that data was received and is accurate. Now, we did not go so far and did not feel like we needed to go so far as to say you need to literally pick up every package and scan it and check it. But you do need to have some process by which you're doing some checking mechanism. Again, that is the PDG perspective, not giving you legal advice, but that is kind of where we landed within that PDG conversation. Second question that often comes up is, well, what happens when you actually go through that process and you say, wait, I've got a problem here, right? To Steve's example that he walked through, I received 3 packages and I only got TI for 2 of them. In what we've laid out, again, recognizing we want everybody to have and be able to tailor their own individual business practices, we've really emphasized this framework of identify, understand, and resolve. So first, identify, have those processes and controls in place to identify those discrepancies. We were just talking about it, right? With have some controlled process to scan or do audited checking or some method to identify that, hey, I've got a product and the data on it is not correct. Second step then is understand, right? Have some systems and processes in place to determine, is this a suspect product? Or are there reasons I believe it is a data error and not a suspect product? So have some set of systems and processes once you identify it to say, is this suspect or is it a data error? And then third, if it is a data error, have some mechanism to appropriately address that and document that error. Obviously, if you determine it is suspect, that sends you down a different channel of investigation and reporting potentially. But if you conclude that it is a data error, have some system or process to address it and document it. So again, we emphasized within PDG that everybody within those three buckets, right, should have a lot of flexibility in terms of designing and defining your own individual business practice and considering your own risk tolerance and compliance approach and methodology. But really the emphasis and importance on thinking about each of those three components. How do you identify there's a problem? How do you determine whether that problem is actually a suspect product? And then if it's not, how do you get the right documentation in place? Third, and again, I started to walk through this on our last my last presentation around the blueprint, but how do you actually do the tracing? So I walked through this model, right, of sequential request and response, with the emphasis being on, our focus has been on defining that request and response message and allowing people to handle that internally themselves. In terms of that internal process, one of the things that our dispenser work group kind of worked through is a little bit of a set of questions that you all should think about in terms of defining your SOP around how you will trace. So when a request comes in, who in your shop is going to receive it? How do you know it's going to go to somebody at your pharmacy who's going to be in a position to understand it and understand that it needs to be responded to within 24 hours? Who's going to kick off that internal process? What's your backup if that person, if that person's on vacation, or if it comes in over the weekend? How are you actually then going to vet that request and look at it and say, hey, is this a legitimate request? Are they asking for a legitimate purpose? Is this somebody fishing for information? And how do I get through that decision point quickly? Then deciding, hey, okay, are we going to respond? If we concluded this is a valid request for a valid purpose and I have an obligation to respond, who's going to make that decision and say, yes, we're responding, let's go get the information and get it back? How are you going to gather that data up internally? Where are you going to find it? Do you know how to access it? If you're relying on a contract with a wholesaler to hold that for you, do you know how to get to that data and pull it quickly? Who's going to do that? How are they going to do it quickly? And then kind of how do you bundle that up and get it ready to send? Who's going to put that information together, get it in the right format? And who needs to sign off on that, right? Do you need legal review? Do you need your compliance person to review it? What process are you going to go through to confirm that information before you send it? And then how do you actually package it up and send it securely back to the right place? So again, important, I think, that everybody have the ability to define their own internal systems and processes here in the way that makes sense for their business. But hopefully this is at least just kind of a set of questions that are useful to start thinking through and thinking about the aspects you should be addressing and considering as you put your process together. I won't go through it in as much detail, but then we also had kind of a similar set of questions on the requesting side. So if you are the one who actually has to initiate and execute the trace for your own investigation, how are you going to do all of those steps? Who's going to be involved? How are you going to know where to go with it? How are you going to format it? Who's going to be responsible? Who signs off? Many of those same questions. And so for that reason, I won't repeat them, but think about that side of the process as well. Steve went into this in a good bit of detail, but I think it's an important one, so I'll just quickly kind of touch on it again. This question that keeps coming up, right? Well, what do you mean I can't sell to the pharmacy down the street or loan product to them and get it back, get another version back next week, etc.? Can I still do that? And again, we talked about this yesterday too. Yes, you can, but there's a big but, right? But you probably need to be licensed as a wholesaler to do that, and you need to provide them TI and TS documentation in that process. Emphasis on the probably there, because there are a few exceptions like Steve talked about. You don't need to be licensed and provide that TI if you fall into a few buckets, right? One, if you're under common control, right? So this does not apply to, I'll pick on a chain here. I saw somebody from CVS on, so apologies, but this does not apply to CVS Store 1 sending product over to CVS Store 2, or Max. I know you've got 2 pharmacies, right? Is sending it from one of your pharmacies to your other pharmacy that you own and control. That is all within your corporate entity. If it's to fill a prescription for an identified patient, which is, as Steve talked about here, right? This does not include anticipating a need or shortage and sending it over. This is a specific identified named patient who needs the medication. Or 3, again, as Steve mentioned, if you're selling a minimal quantity from a retail pharmacy, again, emphasis here, this is actually specific, very specific here, from a retail pharmacy to a licensed practitioner for in-office use. And then you have to make sure that's not more than 5% of your activity. So there are some exceptions there. If you fall into one of those 3 buckets, you don't need to be licensed as a wholesaler and provide TI to that next dispenser. But if you're not in one of those 3 categories, yeah, you can still sell it, but you need to be licensed as a wholesaler and you need to provide TI to that second dispenser. And then the last one that I'll touch on here before I kick it over to Max, this came up yesterday, and I think it's always a good reminder, and it comes up a lot. Can I really get in trouble for this, right? Are there actually penalties if I don't do this stuff? And there actually are, and they can be significant. Under the statutory construct of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, failure to comply with the DSCSA is what we call a prohibited act, which then prohibited acts have a number of different penalties that can associate with them. That can include, here as you see, significant financial fines and penalties, potential for jail time, restitution, disgorgement of products, seizure of product, and it also triggers general federal criminal code penalties and fines, which can be very significant financial fines there as well as the potential for state penalties and fines. Now, I'll admit, I threw this up and I put the detail. This is straight out of the statute, so I'm not being this is all true, but it is also a little bit of a scare tactic, right? Typically, FDA is not going to come in and slap you with a fine and throw you in jail for a year because you had an error in one of your documents and had no ill intent there, right? But I do raise this just to point out the fact that, hey, this is a federal law with federal criminal penalties. And you know, as Steve was kind of touching on as well, it's also a federal law with federal criminal penalties that the industry asked for. And so I think we need to be cognizant that there are penalties that in significant impacts that can come from failure to comply, and people should take this seriously. And you know, the last thing I'll say on that last piece, I think one of the interesting pieces as we get into this further will be the extent to which FDA goes into that dispenser level and enforces that level, and the extent to which they defer to the state boards of pharmacy. And how that state board of pharmacy and FDA relationship works in the inspection and enforcement space come 2023. So I don't have an answer for what that will look like, but just to flag that both of those regulators will be in play, and their interrelation and interplay will be one to watch as we move forward. So those were the kind of main questions, again, that I saw and I wanted to just kind of drill down on at another level of detail. And with that, Max, I will kick it to you. I'll try to stop sharing here and kick it over to you on your side.
Can everybody see okay?
Yep.
Alrighty, so I'm kind of taking on the topic of making the case for an industry-developed dispenser DSCSA standard operating procedure template. And the key word here is template. The goal is to come up with a document that goes through all these different types of scenarios and has the detail in there so that a hospital can pick from the detail what's going to work for them. A chain organization can pick from the detail what's going to work for them. An independent pharmacy can pick what's going to work for them. If you just look at Eric's presentation there about tracing, where there were kind of 6 major topics, and inside of those topics there were decisions that needed to be made and so forth. Those kind of things need to be spelled out in an SOP. And I'll get into a whole lot of reasons here and why I think it might be good if we do it from the perspective of an industry. You've got PDG that's had over 70 great organizations involved in putting all of these blueprints together and so forth that have worked through lots and lots of these different scenarios and topics. You have OCI and its membership that has worked through all of the areas around credentialing and what's required to make at least an electronic interoperable communication process work, and the advantages of that. So what are some of the reasons why we really ought to consider making this happen? So one is, what's better? One industry vetted SOP versus 25,000 individual, 30,000 individual type of SOPs. If you think about just the independent pharmacy world combined with the hospitals or specialty pharmacies and so forth, leaving your chains out, you've got 25, 30,000 different organizations. Do we really want them all coming up with their individually developed SOPs, which is a good chance they're going to be deficient in some areas? They're not going to cover things that need to be covered. They're going to be expecting actions from manufacturers, distributors that aren't even possible. They think, oh, well, I'll just write this up. It makes common sense to me. But because the manufacturers and distributors weren't part of that communication, part of that development process, they don't realize it's a dispenser that something they're asking for is just not possible. And so it's the goal of, can we make this template that bridges all of our needs so that it takes into account dispensers, it takes into account distributors, it takes into account manufacturers, and comes up with something that's mutually beneficial and fits everybody's needs. One of my worries is that there's education not only in need as part of the dispensers and, of course, all parts of the supply chain, but there's a need of education on part of the regulatory agencies. And what does DSCSA really allow them to do? And if we come up with a good SOP, then that should really help put some boundaries, some guidelines about what the different agencies, whether it's an attorney general in your state, whether it's the board of pharmacy, whether it's FDA, whether it's the sheriff down the street, what are the kind of things that at least under DSCSA they can really come in and ask to do? And so if the industry as a whole says, hey, here's what we see needs to be covered in a dispenser template, these are the kind of things that you can come in because we're ready to answer your requests based on these guidelines. I'd like to point out that anybody who has written an SOP from scratch, it's very hard and it's very time consuming. Let's take a look at about time. So let's say we had 25,000 pharmacy locations developing their own SOPs. And let's pretend that the amount of staff time to write this was 40 hours per location. I think that's way too low of a number, but let's just pretend for easy math. So you got 25,000 locations at 48 hours per location. You got 1 million hours of development time across the dispenser community. Now let's say that it was going to cost you staff-wise $55 an hour. Again, probably low, but let's just say that. At $55 an hour to $1 million, that's $55 million that the industry is going to spend coming up with an SOP. I don't really think that's the best use of industry time, pharmacist time, to spend that kind of expense, which again, I believe that's a low expense. I think it easily could be double or triple that. And most likely you're still going to have deficient SOPs for an awful lot of those. The other thing I like about it is a well-done SOP really becomes what? It becomes a training document for everybody involved. It's the kind of thing that once that's done, then somebody like NCPA, APHA, ASHP, and others could use as a training for training classes. So you go out to one of their conferences and they have a section on DSCSA SOP Template integration, and you can go through that and you're learning the materials, you're learning the things that you need for next year. And the other thing, because we're all concerned about how all these pharmacies are going to be compliant by next year, this would really speed up the process. If all of these pharmacies don't have to spend time on their SOPs, they can just kind of go through and accept and check off how they're going to do things and then train their staff. It's going to speed up everything that's going to be required to get compliant for next year. What types of SOP templates are needed? And I in no means want to say that this is a complete list, but I just wanted to give an idea. You know, you're going to have your general SOP, how you kind of daily deal with issues. How are you going to do with your EPCIS data? Are you going to get it? Somebody going to store it for you? How are you going to get it when it's a drop ship or it's a 340B order? Again, your illegitimate suspect product identification SOP, notification when you do have an illegitimate product, your order receiving, your product identification, your quarantine, all the way down your waste documentation. How do you prove that you're only working with authorized trading partners? There's all of this detail. And this is not a total list. And so for every independent pharmacy out there, every hospital out there, to go through this process on their own, I think it's asking a lot. I did want to remind everybody from the dispenser community that PDG does have a bi-weekly dispenser work group meeting. It's been going on for several months now. PDG has done a great job with it and helping to bring this stuff out and go through topics. And recently, they've been kind of taking a hit at this idea of an SOP, and you know they handle a topic and they kind of talk it through and show things that you should consider in your SOP. So what we're doing right now, I'm doing anyways at least, is I'm looking for volunteers from all areas of the supply chain to be part of a team to put together an SOP template. Again, the key is that it's a template. I'm asking everybody to help our nation's dispensers, and if you're not a dispenser but other part of the supply chain, you're probably going to be helping yourself out. You can contact me, send an email to dscsa@arcscan.com and just put in the subject line DSCSA SOP volunteer. Now OCI has committed to holding a first meeting of everybody who's going to volunteer. It's on December 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern time, and you can sign up for that right here. So encouraging everybody to please sign up, and we'll go from there and see if we can put this together.